This is the new 2022 Porsche 911 GT3, and, well, do I even need to say any more? Here in North America, the GT3 has been Porsche's track-focused 911 model for about 20 years now, and now the new one is coming out based on the new generation 992 Porsche 911. And today, I'm going to review it. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my new enthusiast car auction website for cool cars from the modern era. We've had some great sales recently on Cars and Bids, including this E30 BMW M3, which sold for $59,000, amazing car. This Mercedes C63 AMG, which sold for over $40,000, a recent record price for a C63. And this Ferrari 612, which brought $90,000 on Cars and Bids. So, if you're looking to sell your cool car from the 1980s and up, Cars and Bids is the place to do it for the most views and interest in your car. And if you're looking to buy a cool car, check out Cars and Bids with daily auctions and great selection only at carsandbids.com. So let's talk GT3. Just like the outgoing Porsche 911 GT3, the 991.2 model, this one uses a 4-liter naturally aspirated 6-cylinder engine with about the same 500 horsepower. It also offers the choice between 2 transmissions, the PDK automatic or a manual transmission, with most buyers here in North America likely to prefer the manual. But there are some differences, of course. The new GT3 is based on the new 911 model, the 992, and that means it's a completely different car from the old GT3. Totally new on the outside, totally new on the inside, and new technology. It also has some major changes under the skin: aerodynamics, suspension, brakes, all sorts of enhancements designed to make it faster. Of course, expect a higher performance GT3 RS to be coming relatively soon, along with a more subtle GT3 Touring coming on down the line. But today is for this GT3. Today I'm going to take you on a thorough tour of this GT3 and show you all of the quirks and features of the latest high-performance 911. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a DOUGSCORE. Alright, time for the quirks and features of the new 911 GT3. Now, it's worth noting I have already reviewed the new Porsche 911, both the regular model and the turbo, so in this video I'm going to cover some regular 911 highlights, but I'm mainly going to focus on the cool new stuff about the GT3, which, by the way, comes out this fall. Now, the most interesting thing, at least to me, about this car is it has about the same horsepower as the outgoing model, 500 horses, but it's significantly faster. Porsche says 17 seconds faster around the Nürburgring than the old car, even though it has the same power. So how is that possible? The answer is a lot of little improvements, little quirks and features, you might say, that have changed all throughout the car, and I'm going to show you all of them. I'm going to start with the wing back here. You can see the wing has sort of an unorthodox way of being mounted. The supports for the wing don't mount to the bottom, but rather they go over the top and mount the wing there. Porsche calls this the swan neck wing mounting position. And it's certainly unusual. And the reason they do this is by putting the supports for the wing on top instead of underneath, it allows a greater surface area under the wing for air to travel through, which increases this car's downforce, which of course helps keep it planted on the road and improves the handling just because of this rather unorthodox wing design. Also around back, and also relating to downforce, is the rear diffuser in this car. This GT3 is the first one to ever have an active rear diffuser, and Porsche says it provides 4 times more downforce than the outgoing model's rear diffuser. That is a pretty impressive figure, and of course, again, more downforce equals better handling. The result of the aero upgrades around back means that this car makes 50% more downforce in its least aggressive configuration, and more than 150% more downforce in its most aggressive track-focused ready state. And more downforce equals better handling. That helps that lap time despite not having more power. But it's not just aerodynamic upgrades back here designed to make this car faster. You also have a new exhaust, which is lighter than the one in the outgoing car by a little over 20 pounds. And of course, less weight equals more speed. And in fact, weight savings is a theme throughout this car. There is weight saved everywhere, and I'm going to show you some of the highlights and some of the more interesting weight savings measures Porsche has taken with this GT3. The result of all the weight savings is that this car is only about 11 pounds heavier than the old GT3, which is pretty impressive because this is a physically larger car, but they've pulled weight out of so many places that it's basically the same weight as the old one. Of course, the exhaust, in addition to being lighter, also sounds pretty good. Take a listen to a couple of revs. And next up, another little incremental quirk change to help make this car a little faster than the outgoing model, despite not having any more power, is the wheels. The wheels are bigger than in the outgoing GT3, and they're staggered for the first time ever in a GT3, meaning the front wheels are smaller than the back wheels. You have 20-inch wheels up front and 21s in back. They are also wider for a wider contact patch with the ground, but they are not heavier than the prior GT3 wheels. In fact, they're a little bit lighter despite being a little bit larger. So you have larger wheels, wider tires, but no weight penalty. And another big benefit of the wheels being larger is the ability to fit larger brakes. Up front, your brakes are over 16 inches in diameter, absolutely huge, which provide maximum stopping power for this car. This particular car has Porsche carbon ceramic brakes, which are a very expensive option. You can see the yellow painted caliper, which usually signals carbon ceramic brakes. Carbon brakes save another 37 pounds or so compared to regular brakes, so another weight savings there. By the way, one interesting carbon ceramic brake detail with this car: you can paint the caliper black if you want. For years and years, yellow calipers have signaled carbon ceramic brakes on Porsche models, but now they're letting you choose yellow or black if you want to do that. So just because you don't see a yellow caliper no longer means it doesn't have carbon ceramic brakes. Porsche is finally letting you paint the brake caliper. A big surprise for Porsche, who was very set that all carbon brakes had to be yellow. Well, that's no longer true. And by the way, speaking of those brake calipers, yellow, but you can paint them to be black, it is worth mentioning that, like in other Porsche models, personalization options are plentiful in this car. For instance, here you can see that the wheel lip has been painted blue to match the exterior color of the car. And in fact, there's also a blue painted rim around the headlights to also match the exterior color of the car. So you can see blue accents matching the blue exterior paint to make this car a little bit more personalized, which has been very popular with Porsche models in the last few years. But as cool and as tempting as the personalization options are with Porsche, they certainly don't come cheap. I hold in my hand the build sheet for this particular car. The starting price of a new 911 GT3 is around $161,000, but this car has a total sticker price of just over $196,000, meaning this car has around $35,000 in options, including some of those personalization features. For example, the little blue color matching rim around the wheels, yeah, that's a $2,000 option if you want your wheels to match your paint color. The little blue rim matching the exterior color around the headlights, that would be a $1,600 option. It isn't cheap. And the exterior color itself, $4,220 for this color, which Porsche calls shark blue. So to have all those three things matching in this color, you're looking at like $9 grand extra. But at least you can say your Porsche is special. And by the way, one other pricey option on this list is the front axle lifter system. This car is pretty low, and so the front end is going to scrape on a lot of stuff, but you can get an axle lifter that lifts it up an inch in front to help clear like steeper driveways or whatever. That axle lifter costs almost $3,700 extra. It is a tremendously expensive option, but it does have a very cool quirk to it. It is linked to GPS, so you can go into your infotainment system and program it to lift up the car car whenever it gets to a certain point. So for instance, you have a steep driveway at home, you can program the car to lift up every time you turn down your street to come home. You're driving home, you pull down your street, the car lifts itself up. By the time you're at your driveway, it is already in the lifted position and you just pull right in. That is a pretty cool feature, GPS-linked front axle lifter system. And next up, a few other interesting quirks and features on the outside of the car I'd like to cover before I move inside. For one thing, I want to talk general styling. Obviously, this is based on the new 992 911, so it's a different GT3 than the old one, but it still has the same basic, easily identifiable GT3 characteristics, like more aggressive styling up front. In back, obviously the big wing. It looks like a GT3, just modernized, which makes sense because that's what it is. You also see up front these two little holes in the front trunk area for airflow, and right below those you have a front diffuser, which is manually adjustable, Porsche tells me. With a little wrench you can get down there and change the angle on this diffuser, which I guess you'll want to do if you're a serious track driver and you think you can actually get some benefit out of changing it just a little bit. One other interesting exterior item on this car would be the glass. This car has lightweight glass, Porsche says. The old GT3 didn't, but by fitting lightweight glass to this one, they save a little over 10 pounds. Again, another little weight savings, but another way to make this car just a little bit quicker. And one other exterior item that is very much worth noting, getting into the engine compartment, you can't do it. You go into the driver's door sill and you pull up on this little button to pop the engine release, except all that really opens up is this little flap. That's it. You open that up and you can see there's a couple of places where you can add fluid, but it doesn't actually open the engine cover. Now, interestingly, there is a similar flap in back over on the other side of the one that opens, but that doesn't do anything. Doesn't open, doesn't have a purpose. It's really just there for symmetry. It doesn't give you access, but either way, nothing is going to open up the engine cover. That is fixed in place and you can't see it. There's no way to get back here, open up your hood and look at your engine in the new GT3. Although Porsche tells me that even if you could open this cover back here, it wouldn't really matter. For weight distribution purposes, the engine has now moved so low and far down in the car that even if you could open this, you wouldn't really be able to see all that much. So apparently you're not really losing anything by not having this open. And next up, since I'm back here talking about the engine, it's worth noting that even though this car has a 4-liter naturally aspirated flat six with about 500 horsepower, just like the outgoing GT3, the engine in this one is heavily revised, very different compared to that car's. Instead, it's very similar to the outgoing 911 Speedster model, and that was sort of the cool thing about the old 911 Speedster. It had the outgoing car's body, but it had the new GT3's engine. With that said, the engine in this GT3 is a little different from the Speedster's engine. Porsche says they've made a few more revisions to the powertrain to again save a little more weight, about 25 pounds lighter in this engine compared to the one in the Speedster from before. But otherwise, they are fairly similar engines. And by the way, worth noting, this is now the only naturally aspirated 911 in Porsche's lineup. All the rest of the models are turbocharged, except this one. One other weight savings note, Porsche is now using a lightweight battery in this car, which again saves just a little bit of weight, in this case about 22 pounds, going from a standard battery to a lightweight one. Like I said, weight savings truly everywhere in this car. By the way, two other items worth noting outside this car are two other 992 design touches that help distinguish this GT3 from the old one. One is the light bar around back. All 992 models have this thin light bar that goes the whole way across, a very distinctive look. Light bars are very much in with the trends right now, and the GT3 gains the 992's light bar since it is now a 992. You also have the 992's door handles, which are a little unusual. Right now the car is locked, and so the door handle is sort of flat against the door, but you press the unlock button on the key fob and the door handle pops out so you can easily grab it. Again, sort of a 992 design quirk now on the GT3. And next up, climbing inside the GT3, the very first thing you notice in here is there is a gear lever in the middle, which means that this car has a manual transmission. Except actually it doesn't. That is a PDK gear lever intended to sort of look like a manual transmission lever. This car has an automatic, but they wanted it to look cool and manually, and so this is how it looks. Now this is very different from the shifter in the regular 911, which you can see here, just this little switch basically rising up from the center. In the GT3, GT3, you have this manual looking thing for PDK. Now, a few interesting things about the way this PDK lever operates in this car. You engage the gears by pushing down on the top, which is actually a button, and then you can go between park, reverse, neutral, drive, as you can see. One other interesting item, you can move the gear lever over and go into manual mode, and then you can shift gears using the lever. I mention that as interesting because the regular 911 with its little switch only lets you shift gears using the paddles on the steering wheel, but in the GT3 you can also use the lever if you so desire. Now, a couple of interesting things worth noting about the PDK transmission in this car. It is a 7-speed PDK in the new GT3 compared to an 8-speed PDK in the regular 911. They are entirely different transmissions. The 911 has an 8-speed, this has a 7-speed, different units. The 7-speed isn't just an 8-speed with one less gear. But by going with the 7-speed, it is a physically smaller unit and thus lighter, and Porsche saves a little over 40 pounds, the GT3's PDK, compared to the one in the regular 911. Interesting. With that said, if lightness is your ultimate goal, the lightest weight possible, you won't want PDK at all. There is a manual transmission available for this car. It is a zero-cost option, so you can choose between the two at no cost, and the manual is just under 40 pounds lighter than the PDK. So it's lighter to go with the manual. But of course, PDK is faster. The dual clutch can shift insanely quickly, and Porsche says 0 to 60 about 3.2 seconds with this car with the PDK versus maybe about 3.5 seconds with the manual. So the PDK is heavier than the manual, but it's faster. It can just shift better than you can. By the way, one interesting note about the transmission selecting in this car. In order to prepare for this video, I was on a call with Andreas Pruninger, who is the head of GT car development for Porsche in Germany, and he said that when they were bringing the manual transmission back to the GT3, he made a friendly wager with the head of Porsche in North America of what the take rate would be for the manual transmission. He thought 50% of buyers would choose the manual, and the head of Porsche North America thought maybe 20% of buyers would choose the manual. In reality, almost 70% of North American buyers chose a manual for the last generation GT3. The manual is actually more common than the automatic. More people want the manual transmission. Yes, it's slower, but we all think it's more engaging, and so people tend to go for the manual. Very interesting, and very interesting that these professional Porsche executives got it wrong. They thought people would want faster, but actually people want more fun, even if it comes at the expense of speed. But anyway, next up, before I get into the interesting quirks and features in front, I want to talk about the back for a second. This car doesn't have any rear seats, none of the GT3 models do, and removing the rear seats allows Porsche to save weight, 22 pounds compared to a regular 911, which is pretty good. Also, here's another crazy weight savings. They have decided to use thinner carpeting back here where the rear seats used to go, and that lets Porsche save 2.6 pounds. Very small, but it's little incremental changes like that that help make this car faster, and that is certainly one of them. But anyway, back to the front seats, some interesting quirks up here. For one thing, you have these carbon fiber sport bucket racing seats, which of course are lighter than regular seats. They're also very grippy. They keep you in place on the racetrack. That's their purpose. You can also see they're perforated in the center, and inside the perforation they have blue to match the car's exterior color, which looks pretty cool. It's a nice little touch, I must say. Now next up, an interesting item unique to the GT3. This little drive mode dial on the steering wheel allows you to choose between 3 different modes, sort of a normal mode, a sport, and a track. The unique part is what happens to the gauge cluster. You can see in normal mode and sport mode, there are a few screens with gauges around the center tachometer, but you switch into track mode and those gauges go away. Instead, you're left with only the basics, like vehicle temperature, oil pressure, tire pressure, the stuff you actually need to see on the track. None of this other crap that would be distracting if you're actually on the racetrack, and that is a pretty cool touch, going into the track drive mode and getting a track-focused gauge cluster. Now, interestingly, in the middle of this little drive mode dial on the steering wheel, there's a button. In most Porsche models, this activates the sport response for an instant boost of power, but in this car, you press it and it pulls up a settings menu in the little gauge cluster screens that allows you to configure what happens when you go into sport mode and track mode in this car. You can see in this menu, you can choose between various different items that you want to have happen or not have happen when you go into sport or track mode. So you can kind of configure what happens when you go into track mode, like if you want to turn off the auto start stop, if you want to put the PDK in race mode, if you want to adjust the traction control, all that stuff can be configured to happen or not depending on your preferences, which you can adjust in this screen. Now, interestingly, one option you have with this car is the ability to turn off the traction control systems in sort of levels. You can see a button here in the center that says ESC off, which allows you to turn off the stability control, but it keeps the traction control on. But there's a second button next to that that says ESC and TC off. That turns off both stability control and traction control, so you can decide just how professional of a driver you think you are. You can decide exactly which safety systems you want to turn off when you're on the racetrack. That way you don't have to be all or nothing. You can choose. That's kind of cool too. But anyway, moving off some of the GT3 specific stuff, I found some other interesting quirks and features in here. One very quirky quirk is the cup holder situation. You can see right now there is a cup holder in the center of the console, which makes sense, but if you press this little tab at the top of the cup holder, you can remove it. You can simply take it out. And Porsche provides each 911 with a second option here. You can install instead this little storage tray in case you don't really want a cup holder. So you can choose like what storage compartment you have in your center console, which is certainly an interesting quirk. Also worth noting, you do have a second cup holder in here over to the side of the dashboard next to the glove box. You press this and a cup holder pops out. So there are two cup holders in here if you want them, one for driver, one for passenger, which of course is pretty nice. Now next up, I want to go back to the gauge cluster for a second because it's kind of interesting. In the center, you have this fixed tachometer, like you can see, a real old school gauge that is actually a gauge, but all around it is just screens and they're largely configurable. On the left side, those gauges are pretty much fixed, but over on the right, you can go through various different items in this screen to see kind of whatever you want. You can see like trip data, vehicle data, you can have a map pull up here, which is pretty cool. You can see some performance data like your G-forces, various different things over on this right screen, depending on what you want to see at any given time. It's pretty configurable. Next up, speaking of screens, I want to go into the infotainment system for a second, where I have found a rather interesting quirk. Now, I'm not going to cover the whole system. I have already thoroughly covered it in other Porsche models, which I will link in the description below. But if you go into the car menu, pretty deep in there, you can find something that says service history. You tap on that and it actually shows this car's service history from Porsche dealers in its past. So no more saving paper service records or trying to figure out when you had your last oil change. Your actual service history can be inputted here into the infotainment system. Now, this is a European spec car. I'm not sure if that feature is on US models, but either way, it's really cool and I love to see it there. And I hope more brands add this because it makes it easier to figure out when you had your last service, of course. And next up, another very interesting quirk. On this steering wheel, Porsche has finally added a next track button to move on to the next audio track if you're listening to music or whatever. Porsche hasn't had this on their steering wheel in years. It's been incredibly annoying, but it is finally there. You can press that and change tracks. It's good that they have it there because otherwise changing the track is kind of weird. It's this little electronic button to the upper left of the shifter. You have to kind of push down and tap on it, and that changes track. It would be annoying to take your hand off the wheel every time to push that, so it's nice that they have it on the steering wheel. And by the way, other controls in this area above the gear lever, you can see the climate controls are the main thing up here. You can adjust the temperature, the fan speed, all that kind of stuff. And you also have this little dial over on the passenger side and some other buttons. Those adjust the infotainment system. So if for some reason you don't want to use it as a touchscreen, you can use the buttons and dial here to go through different infotainment menus, although frankly, it's right there and using it as a touchscreen would be pretty easy. But you have the option. And so those are the quirks and features of the new Porsche 911 GT3. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the new GT3. It is pretty cool to spend time in a GT3 right before it's coming out. I mean, this is, you know, the kind of one of the ultimate versions of one of the ultimate cars, and this only happens once every 6-7 years that there's a new one. So it's pretty neat. So first impression when you drive this car, clearly you get inside and just from a moment you can tell it has more of like a hard-edged feel to it than a regular 911 does. Obviously you're sitting in this seat, this like tight bucket seat, so that kind of telegraphs what the experience is going to be like, but instantly I can tell you just hear more exhaust. You know, the regular 911 is sort of evolving to become kind of a gentleman's car, not really the sports car that it once was. And these cars are sort of taking that mantle. The GT cars is like the true sports cars of the 911 lineup. Wow. Man, as always, I mean, there's not many surprises when you're driving a GT3 if you've driven a lot of them before. Because the truth is, they just drive fantastically. They're incredibly quick. They change direction incredibly quickly. Listen to that. Steering is just incredibly precise, unbelievably so. The car corners dead flat. The other thing that I like about the steering that's interesting, I just drove the Ferrari SF90, and that car has an unbelievably precise steering. You just tap the steering wheel and it immediately turns, which is really cool, very, very quick. But this car is more linear, definitely. It definitely has more of like a traditional, like you gotta give it a little bit more effort to actually turn and go anywhere, but you're rewarded by the ratio feels very predictable. The car stays totally flat. It's a very good, easy cornering experience. Gear changes are instantaneous. You know, I hate to say it, I love a manual. And if I was buying, I would get a manual. Wouldn't even be a consideration. I wouldn't even think about which transmission. But you get why people get PDK. Obviously, it's easier. There's a lot of people out in the world who simply don't know how to drive or don't want to drive frequently a manual transmission. But the other big benefit is it's much faster. And if you're actually serious about tracking this car, there's something to that. Now, I will tell you, this car feels very fast. It really does. But it definitely feels like it could be faster. I've driven the new 911 Turbo, that unquestionably feels faster. This is 0 to 60 in like low 3s, 3.2, 3.3. It feels that fast, but you just know that there's more there, that they're not quite exploiting. And part of the reason for that is it's just not any more, it won't feel any faster than the last GT3 when you're like doing that. When you're like flooring it up an on-ramp, it's just gonna feel like the last GT3. You only really start to take advantage of some of this car's benefits over the old one from a performance standpoint when you're on the racetrack, when you're using the lighter weight, the aero, the wider patch on the tires, you know, gripping, the better brakes, the better suspension. You have the new front suspension is a dramatic improvement. All these kinds of things are best felt not accelerating. If you just want to go fast in a straight line, you might be a little disappointed about this compared to old GT3, but then that's never really been the point of the GT3. I mean, it's just an incredibly well put together package like the GT3 always is. There's not really any surprises here. This is an amazing car. Although I will say it's gotten more and more expensive. You know, these other automakers have given Porsche room to make this car more expensive, but back in my day, I remember when a new GT3 was 120, 130, maybe 150. This starts at 160, and then you put many options on it from there. I mean, 200 is not out of the realm for this car, and you're not even in the GT3 RS. Still, it's hard to go wrong with a GT3. It just offers an unbelievable combination of driving experience, excellent workmanship, excellent reliability. It's a good car that just got a little bit better, and so all the crowd who loves these is going to have to go buy the new one because it's faster and it's cooler and it's more exciting. And so that's the new Porsche 911 GT3. Incredible, truly amazing car. You know, I have been critical of the Porsche 911 for growing ever larger and more luxurious with each passing generation, and that's true, but the GT3 is still a brilliantly focused true sports car with amazing performance, and I'm thrilled that I had the chance to spend the day with it and drive it. And now it's time to give the new GT3 a DOUGSCORE. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the GT3 looks nice. It'll never be as beautiful as some of its cleaner rivals, but it gets a 7 out of 10. Acceleration does 0 to 60 in 3.2 seconds, and it gets a 9 out of 10. Handling is excellent, not quite on the steering precision level with the best supercars, but great linear steering feel and fantastic balance, and it gets a 9 out of 10. Fun factor is fantastic. You can really toss it around and have a great time, and it gets a 9 out of 10, though it would be a bit more fun with 3 pedals. Finally, cool factor, and this is very cool, not quite supercar cool, but the newest GT3 is always exciting, and it gets an 8 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 42 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. This is reasonably well equipped, but it lacks some important creature comforts like, power seats, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Comfort isn't as bad as I was expecting, not as bad as a GT3 RS, but it's still pretty harsh, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Quality is excellent. Everything is well made, and these have a strong reputation for reliability even with hard track use, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Practicality is compromised with only 2 seats and such a high price tag, and it gets a 2 out of 10. Finally, value, and this goes 2 ways. For one thing, it's very expensive, more than prior GT3 models, and ever trending upwards, but these also hold their value well, so you won't lose much, so I'm giving it a 6 out of 10 for a total daily score of 26 out of 50. Added up, and the DOUGSCORE is 68 out of 100, which places it here against relevant cars about right. The new GT3 is tied with the Audi R8 and the Mercedes-AMG GTR, but the GT3 has a higher weekend score than either of those, and the GT3 falls just short of the supercar class, the Huracans, and the Ferraris, which makes sense. This is a great car, and I can't wait for the GT3 RS.